We're now on Daf Yud Gimel Amid Beis, and we're discussing the status of a min who's known to be an idol worshiper. And the question is whether or not they are careful about their wives, letting their wives go out and lead a loose, immoral life, and therefore we should consider their children as mamzerim, meaning that this is a child from a different husband. So obviously, we're talking about a Jewish min, because otherwise there's no discussion about mamzerim. Now, all this is according to one Tana, but according to Tanakama, ishto lo mafkir. That far they don't go. The husband, who's a min, will not allow his wife just to go prancing around and have these immoral relations. So therefore, according to Tanakama, we don't consider the children as mamzerim, and that which we learned according to that first brisa, that's the opinion of the Tanakhama. He doesn't mention anything about mamzer. It's only the Yesh Omrim, which is the second opinion, the last opinion quoted in the brisa. They go as far as to say that the children of the minim are mamzer. Okay, now we go back to our Mishnah. Amar Mar, shchitas avodas ovid kolchovim nevela. In other words, when a guy shechts an animal, we don't assume that he's slaughtering it for the sake of idolatry, and therefore the carcass and the animal is mutar b'ano. It's not avodah zarah. So the Gemara says, "V'neicho shema minhu." How can we allow you to sell the carcass or use its meat for whatever you use it for, hides and so forth and so on, when this is a Gentile, this is a non-Jew? Why don't you suspect that he's doing it for the sake of avodah zarah? Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Huna, ein minin be'umos ha'olam. Now, again, if you take this formulation literally, he's saying that amongst the Gentiles there are no minim. All the minim in the world are Jews. So Gemara says, "V'alka chazina de'ika." That's not true. We know for a fact that many of the Gentiles are absolute, dedicated, devoted to idol worship. Emo, you have to reformulate. What Rav Nachman was saying was, "Ein rov ovikacham minim." Your average guy is not totally dedicated to avodah zarah, such that every time he shechts an animal, we have to assume that he did so for the sake of his god, for his idols. Sover Loki Hadi Omar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Rav Yochanan Nachrim shebechutz laaretz lav ovdei avodas kolchov mehem el minig avoseim biyadeihem. Okay, so this is a sugya that we didn't get up to, which differentiates between the Goyim in Eretz Yisrael and the Goyim outside of the land of Israel. The Goyim in Eretz Yisrael were quite devout in their dedication to idolatry, but the Goyim throughout the world were less committed, if you will, to the worshiping of idols. So why then do we find that the Goyim outside of the land of Israel worship idols? That's called minig avoseim b'yadeim. They're not devout, dedicated to it, and maybe that's what they saw. Their father did it, so they'll do it. They have this little getchka, the little idol, and they inherited it from their father. It's an heirloom, and so they kiss and bow down to this idol, but they're not really, consistent about it. So therefore, we don't assume that when they slaughtered an animal and they want to, market the meat, that it was avodah zarah. Omer Rav Yosef bar Yomi, Omer Rav Nachman. Ein minin be'umos ovi kol chav. In other words, the din of a min, with all the different ramifications, including the fact that it's shchitas, is avodah zarah, and it's also bana, that doesn't apply to goyim. Gemara says, Lamai, if you're telling me that the shchita of a guy is nevela, which means that it's mutar b'ano, but it's also b'achila, is hashta shchitas min di Yisrael amar asura, is dovi kochob miboile? Why did you have to tell me this halacha that the that the law of min doesn't apply to a Gentile? But I don't get it. If we know for a fact that this Gentile is a min, so what? Only if it's a Yisrael min, then it's usur, completely usur by no. It's considered like a sacrifice to the idols. But if it was a guy, it's not considered a sacrifice to the idols. How can that be? And that's what Gemara says, the Ovi Kachov mi boy, like a rhetorical question. Do I have to tell you that the minim amongst the Goyim, their shchita creates avodah zarah? For sure. Ella, what are you going to tell me? Lemoridim. There's a halacha of moridim. Moridim means that in the case of idolatry, if we can't kill the idolater, we can push him into a pit and leave him there until he dies. Sort of like an indirect cause of his death. It's a kind of form of capital punishment called moridin. And once again, the Gemara asks the following question: are you telling me ein minim b'umas the law of a min doesn't apply if the guy's a guy? Hashta d'Yisrael moridim. If there's a Jew who's an idol worshiper, we're going to push him, off this precipice. And the avodas kachab mi boy. I mean, you want to say that the guy who's raised on avodah zarah and he's totally devout and dedicated to avodah zarah, so we're not going to apply the halacha of moridin? So once again, we have to go back to this drawing board and figure out what did Rav Yosef Bar Yomi, the name of Rav Nachman, have in mind when he said that a guy doesn't have the status of a min. Omar Rav Ukva Bar Chama, lekabel mehen korban. If a Jewish min who's known to be a devout idolater comes to offer his own korban in the Beis Hamikdash, we will not accept it. But we're going to derive from a pasuk, a miyut in a pasuk, that if a guy who's a min offers to bring a voluntary korban into the Beis Hamikdash, we'll accept it. Why? This sanya we learned in a brayso, mikem v'lo kulchem lahotzias hamumar, right? Except a korban from them. From them is a miyut to exclude lo kulchem, and that excludes a mumar. Now, I'm a little bit confused. It says here a mumar, but I think it really is referring to a min. Anyway, mikem, once again, another drasha, bachem chilati v'lo ba'ovis kochav. In other words, when a person is Jewish and he's a mumar, then we don't accept his korban. But with regard to a guy, through this miyut, we derive the conclusion that a guy doesn't have that status of a mumar. Now, what's he rejecting? He was brought up as an idolater. So the pasuk forbids accepting a voluntary offering from a mumar, but the pasuk indicates that we did not distinguish amongst the Gentiles, and therefore we can accept a korban from a Gentile even if he's a min. So the Gemara says, "Mimai Dilma Hachi Kamar." You know what? The brayso says that there's no din in Goyim, but what does it mean there's no din in Goyim? Maybe it means B'Yisrael matzdiki kabel, mirsham lo tkabel, al be'ovi kacham klal v'klal lo. Meaning, with regard to a Jew who wants to bring a korban, we differentiate between a tzaddik and a rasha. But as far as the goyim are concerned, maybe we don't accept any of their korbanos, period. Lo salkadaita. And this Gemara we've already learned in the past, the Sanya, ish, ma tamaloma ish ish. Why does the Torah repeat the word ish twice to tell you that you accept a korban? L'rabos savodas kochom she'nodru nidarim u'nidavos ki Yisrael. That we do accept voluntary korbanos from a goy. So therefore, we're not going to differentiate between a guy who's a renegade and he's a mumar and another kind of guy. They're all in the same boat, and the Torah says we can accept their korbanos. Now, the Mishnah tells us that if the guy shechted a korban, it has the status of nevela. Nevela is metame b'masa. So the Gemara says Pshita came in neveli metame. Why did the Mishnah have to bother telling me? We know that that an nevela is metame b'masa, and that's a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Yud Aleph. Omar Rabba Hachi Kamer. What is the Mishnah trying to be machadesh? Zu metame b'masa. It's only by implication. The Mishnah is telling me yesh l'acheres shehi metame afilu ba'ohel. So a nevela, if a human being finds himself in the same ohel, under the same roof as a nevela, he does not contract tum unless he picks up the nevela. However, there is another case where the tumah is generated by ohel, and that's going to be avodah zarah. Ezo, zu tikrovas avodas kochavim ki Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. According to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, if you and a sacrifice that was sacrificed for the sake of idolatry find yourselves in under the same roof, you're tummy. And the Gemara is going to derive this from a pasuk. Ika de Amri, we have another version. Amar Rava Hachiktani, Zu metame b'masa, yeshcha acheres shehi kizu, shemetame b'masa, ve'ena metame b'ohel, ezezu tikrobes amos kacham udelok Rabbi Yehuda. So Rava is now reinterpreting the Mishnah in such a way that he's saying that the Mishnah by implication is telling us that there is no tumas ohel, even though it was shechted for the purpose of avodas kochavim, and that's against Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, who holds that takrovas avodah zarah, that's which was slaughtered for the sake of idolatry, is metame v'ohel. Tisanya, where do we have this machlokes? It's in a brayso. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira omer minayin l'tikrovas avodas kochavim metame v'ohel. How do I know that if you're under the same roof as an animal that was shechted from avodah zarah that you're tameh? Shenemar vayitzomdu lebal pior vayochlu zivchei mesid. Now, at the time of the Avera of Benos Midjan, which is recorded in the Torah in just one second. This is not a pasuk in Chumash. So again, in Bamidbar Yutes, we have that parsha, but here we're talking about a pasuk in Tehillim. And the pasuk is equating the avodah zarah with zivchei mesim, because you remember the girls would not agree until they would have to bow down to Pa'or. Do you remember that? Anyway, so ma meis mitami. Why did the Torah compare it to a mess after krovas amos kol mitami be ohel? And this leads us to the Mishnah here in the bottom. Hashochet b'layla. Now, clearly, if it's pitch black and there's no light at night, then the shochet can't really see exactly what he's shechting. He's doing it sort of like robotically. And yet, the Mishnah is machshir his shchita, v'chein suma, can't see. So Gemara says hashochet. It doesn't say muta lishchot. It says hashochet. He went ahead and he shechted at night, or the suma shechted. Do you have it in lechatchila lo, Ramini? I'm going to prove to you that even lechatchila, the Brisa is going to establish li olam shochten, bein bayom bein balayla, bein rosh hagag, bein rosh hasfina. These are places where normally the idol worshippers used to slaughter their sacrifices to the demons, to the gods on the top of the roof, on top of a boat, and yet we're allowed to do it. We'll see exactly why, because it does look like Avodah Zarah when you shecht an animal on top of the roof, on top of the boat, but okay, we'll have to see under what conditions. But in any event, we have a brisa that allows the shechita at night, even lechatchila, against our Mishnah. Amar Papa bishavuka kenegdo. If he lights up the night with a torch, then let him go ahead and shecht. It's just like daytime. You don't need daytime, you need light. Rav Ashi wants to support Rav Papa's interpretation of this brisa. Dekanami, the Katani Hasam Dumya Diyom. The brisa combines Yom and Laila together. And why? Because he has an avuka kenegdo, which makes it like Yom. But in our Mishnah, Dumya de Suma, it compares it to a Suma. Shmamina. And a Suma is like shechting in the dark without any light whatsoever. And that leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Yudal. Okay then? Wishing you a very fine day. Thank you very much.